What if one single family had quietly shaped the economy long before today's corporations existed, leaving behind a trail of silent frauds that still influence the financial system you depend on every day? It sounds dramatic, almost cinematic, but history shows that some of the greatest shifts in wealth and monetary power did not happen in public. They happened behind closed doors, in rooms where decisions were whispered, not announced, and where influence was built through strategies the average person never had a chance to see. This is where the story begins, in a world where economic manipulation was crafted with precision long before modern banking, stock markets, or global corporations became household concepts. To break the ice, imagine living in a society where wealth moved like shadows on a wall, never directly visible, but always shaping the environment around you. While kings and merchants appeared to control the flow of gold, another layer of power operated beneath the surface, using tactics that later became the foundation for financial engineering. These early financial maneuvers hold the same DNA as the systems people experience today. Inflation used as a tool, scarcity manufactured intentionally, and credit manipulated to direct entire markets. When you start to connect these patterns, the past no longer feels distant. It feels uncomfortably familiar. The keywords echo through every century: hidden wealth, silent frauds, monetary manipulation, concentrated power, economic control. These terms did not emerge recently. They were built slowly, methodically, by individuals who understood that the real influence came not from being seen, but from staying invisible. Their actions created cycles of wealth accumulation that affected societies without the public ever fully understanding why prices changed, why shortages happened, or why certain families always seemed to rise while others collapsed. If you have ever felt that financial systems today move in ways that do not make sense, or that someone behind the scenes benefits while the majority struggles, this introduction may already resonate with you. These historical patterns reveal that the present is not a random outcome, but part of a larger chain of decisions made long before you were born. You might even wonder whether you have already experienced traces of these silent manipulations without realizing it. Have you ever felt that sudden shifts in the economy seemed intentional rather than natural? Before we continue unfolding how this family built the foundations of hidden economic power, take a moment to leave a comment sharing whether you have ever sensed that the financial system operates in ways that ordinary people are not meant to fully understand. Your engagement helps this content reach more people. Make sure to like the video and check whether you are already subscribed, because what comes next may surprise you as we move deeper into this story, following the clues that lead to the next layer of influence still shaping the world today. The first signs of this family's influence appeared long before anyone understood what financial power truly meant. In an era when records were scarce and most wealth was measured in land, grain, or metals, they began experimenting with something far more subtle: information control. While the public believed that value came only from physical goods, this lineage discovered that value could be shaped, redirected, and even created through perception. They realized that if they controlled information about supply, demand, and debt, they could shape entire markets without ever displaying their own wealth. This early mastery of financial psychology became the seed of every manipulation that followed. Their first movements were deceptively simple. They offered loans to local leaders, not because they needed repayment, but because debt created dependence. Once dependence existed, they could influence political decisions, trade routes, and the distribution of resources. These weren't the loud, aggressive loans of later banking empires. These were discreet, almost invisible agreements carried out through scribes and intermediaries who ensured that the family's name never appeared on public ledgers. This ability to operate in silence became their greatest advantage, and it allowed them to maneuver long before competitors understood the game being played. As their network expanded, they learned to exploit moments of instability. When a famine threatened a region, they quietly purchased grain before shortages became public knowledge. When a territory prepared for war, they acquired metals that would soon spike in value. Every crisis became an opportunity, every fear a source of profit. They were never the ones blamed for price changes because their involvement remained buried beneath layers of intermediaries. By the time local markets collapsed or recovered, they had already moved on, carrying hidden profits into the next territory. These early strategies formed the foundation of silent frauds that would echo across centuries. The public believed in natural scarcity, natural price fluctuations, natural misfortune. But behind these so-called natural events, subtle manipulations shaped outcomes. This family learned that controlling timing was as powerful as controlling money itself. They mastered the art of appearing uninvolved while guiding the direction of entire economies. As the world evolved, their methods evolved too. They began to influence trade alliances, currency preferences, and early monetary systems. Their power did not depend on owning a throne or commanding an army. It depended on understanding how fragile economic structures could be nudged without detection. And with every generation, their techniques grew more refined, preparing the ground for the sophisticated systems that would emerge later, shaped by the same quiet logic that governed their first hidden operations. The story now shifts toward the moment when these subtle maneuvers transformed into organized cycles of enrichment, creating patterns that would repeat across history and reveal how deeply this family understood the mechanics of wealth long before the world caught on. As their influence spread quietly across regions, the family began constructing the first true cycles of invisible enrichment, patterns designed to generate wealth without attracting attention. They understood that real power did not come from sudden, obvious gains. It came from slow, consistent accumulation hidden beneath ordinary fluctuations of the market. To achieve this, they created a system that allowed them to profit from both abundance and scarcity, using strategies that later financial institutions would adopt on a much larger scale. One of their most effective methods centered on creating artificial imbalances. When they anticipated a rise in demand for a particular commodity, they manipulated its availability long before the public realized anything had changed. They did this not by announcing shortages, but by quietly buying out key suppliers, transporting goods through private routes, and storing resources in discrete locations. When the market finally reacted, they were positioned perfectly, selling at the peak while remaining invisible to those scrambling to understand why prices had shifted so dramatically. But their ambitions extended beyond simple supply manipulation. They began experimenting with early forms of credit expansion, issuing private notes that circulated among merchants who trusted their reliability more than local authorities. These notes became so widely used that they effectively acted as a parallel currency, giving the family the ability to influence liquidity in entire regions. When they increased the flow of these notes, markets expanded. When they restricted them, merchants struggled, and the family could acquire assets at discounted values. This mechanism mirrored what modern institutions would later formalize as monetary policy, yet at the time it operated fully in the shadows. Another key element of their strategy involved orchestrating cycles of controlled collapse. Understanding that panic was one of the most powerful economic forces, they learned to trigger it subtly. By withdrawing credit from certain regions or delaying shipments of essential goods, they allowed fear to ripple through markets. As prices dropped and desperation grew, they re-entered quietly, purchasing land, warehouses, and trade privileges for a fraction of their worth. To the outside world, these downturns appeared natural, the result of misjudgment or misfortune. But those who observed patterns across multiple generations sensed that something deeper was at work. Their mastery of information control also played a crucial role in maintaining these cycles. They employed travelers, scribes, and intermediaries who gathered intelligence long before rumors reached marketplaces. With this advantage, they could anticipate conflicts, famines, and political shifts that would affect trade. They positioned themselves for profit with such precision that their actions seemed almost prophetic to observers who did not understand the extent of their network. This intelligence pipeline became the backbone of their operations, turning knowledge into the most valuable resource they possessed. Ordering. Time. These cycles of gradual enrichment became self-sustaining. Each generation inherited not only wealth, but a blueprint for manipulating the foundations of commerce. Their techniques became more sophisticated as trade expanded across continents, allowing them to influence markets far beyond their original territories. And as these cycles repeated, a recognizable pattern emerged, one that would serve as the template for later financial empires built on the same quiet methods of control. From here, the evolution of their influence shifts into an era where silent frauds began to take on structured forms, shaping the world with a level of precision that would leave lasting marks on economic history. As these strategies grew more refined, the family reached a point where silent frauds no longer emerged as isolated maneuvers, but as a structured system of influence. Their actions were no longer reactive responses to market conditions. Instead, they became proactive architects of those conditions. They learned to shape expectations, dictate value, and manipulate the emotional pulse of entire societies. What made their methods so effective was the illusion of natural order. People believed they were witnessing ordinary fluctuations, unaware that careful hands guided the direction of every shift. The genius of this family's approach was not in brute force, but in subtlety, in knowing exactly how much pressure to apply without drawing suspicion. One of their defining techniques was engineering credibility. They understood that trust is the most powerful currency in any economy. By appearing reliable to local rulers, merchants, and religious authorities, they gained access to networks that others spent decades trying to penetrate. Once inside these circles, they influenced decisions from behind the scenes, steering trade agreements, taxation policies, and even dispute resolutions. Their influence became woven into the structure of governance itself, making their presence almost impossible to separate from the systems they quietly directed. This was also the era when they perfected the art of diversifying influence across multiple industries. Rather than concentrating their wealth in one commodity or region, they spread it through trade routes, guild alliances, and early financial hubs. This diversification gave them unprecedented resilience. When one market faced instability, their reach in another ensured profit continued to flow. Over time, they became the silent stabilizers of crises they themselves helped create. Their ability to control both the rise and fall of markets made them indispensable to leaders who believed they relied on natural forces, not carefully planned cycles. But perhaps the most powerful tool they developed during this phase was narrative manipulation. They shaped the stories people told about economic hardship, prosperity, and scarcity. By influencing which explanations became accepted truth, they guaranteed that the public would never question the deeper mechanisms behind financial change. The family used storytellers, scholars, and religious figures to reinforce beliefs that aligned with their actions. If a market collapsed, it was framed as divine punishment. If prices rose, it became a sign of good harvests. These narratives masked the calculated interventions happening behind the curtain. As their system of silent frauds became more sophisticated, it evolved into something that resembled a prototype of modern corporate mechanisms. Yet, unlike corporations, their structure had no visible headquarters, no public records, no official hierarchy. It was a living network passed down through generations, taught through coded instructions and observation rather than written doctrine. Every manipulation, every discrete shift in supply or credit became part of a legacy that would later influence the foundation of institutional finance. Their operations during this period marked the transition from regional manipulation to widespread economic architecture. They no longer needed to respond to circumstances. They created them. And with each move, they solidified their position as unseen architects of the world's financial evolution, shaping outcomes that would echo through centuries. Before we follow how these strategies evolved into even broader systems of control, share in the comments what part of this silent influence you find most striking, or which pattern feels eerily familiar to what we see today. As their influence expanded across continents, the family refined their silent strategies into mechanisms that would echo through future financial systems. This was the stage where manipulation transformed from isolated interventions into recognizable patterns that still appear in modern economies. They understood that power was not only about accumulating assets, but about shaping the rules of the game itself. By subtly influencing how markets operated, they created a framework that allowed their wealth to grow regardless of external conditions. These early frameworks became templates for practices that would later be repeated by banks, trading houses, and multinational corporations. One of the most impactful evolutions was their ability to manipulate confidence. Markets have always been driven not just by supply and demand, but by belief, fear, and expectation. The family learned to influence these emotional forces with precise timing. When they wanted growth, they encouraged optimism among merchants and rulers, releasing just enough credit and resources to spark momentum. When they wanted contraction, they allowed rumors of instability to circulate, creating caution that slowed economic activity. This emotional engineering proved to be far more powerful than manipulating the goods themselves because it shaped decisions long before they affected physical markets. Another technique that grew during this phase was their early use of layered ownership. Instead of controlling assets directly, they began operating through intermediaries, partners, and shell identities. These layers made it nearly impossible for observers to trace their true influence. While their name never appeared on records, their decisions guided the movement of capital, trade agreements, and even early monetary policies. This structure closely resembles what modern institutions call shadow banking, a system where major financial flows occur outside. Traditional oversight. The family did not invent the term, but they mastered the practice centuries before it entered mainstream analysis. Their understanding of cycles also became sharper. They recognized repeating patterns in agriculture, warfare, political instability, and trade expansions. By learning to anticipate these rhythms, they positioned themselves ahead of crises and recoveries. They could predict when kingdoms would collapse under debt, when empires would overextend their budgets, and when merchant guilds would fall into disputes that disrupted trade. Rather than reacting to these events, they quietly orchestrated conditions that magnified their advantage, using every shift to consolidate more influence. A pivotal development during this era was their manipulation of primitive currencies. As different regions experimented with coinage, metal standards, and early financial instruments, the family positioned themselves as unseen arbiters of value. They influenced which metals were hoarded, which currencies were accepted, and which forms of credit were trusted. By controlling both scarcity and trust, they shaped the evolution of monetary systems themselves. What seemed like organic changes were, in many cases, guided adjustments designed to strengthen their reach. Over time, these evolving strategies formed a repeating structure. create confidence, expand credit, trigger scarcity, acquire assets, restore stability, and profit from every phase. This cycle, visible today in various global crises, was already being rehearsed in markets that lacked the terminology to describe what was happening. Those who lived through these fluctuations believed they were witnessing fate or divine intervention, unaware that a quiet network was shaping outcomes far beyond their line of sight. As we move further into this narrative, the family's methods begin to resemble the blueprint for modern financial power, influencing systems that would later define economies on a global scale. As their influence matured, the family reached a stage where their silent techniques evolved into a sophisticated architecture of global economic power. Their methods were no longer confined to regional manipulation or clever exploitation of crises. They had discovered how to convert subtle financial tricks into long-term leverage, transforming temporary advantages into permanent structures. What made this transition so remarkable was not just their strategic brilliance, but their ability to merge secrecy with scale. They operated through layers of intermediaries, forming networks that resembled early prototypes of multinational financial institutions, yet without leaving behind the institutional footprints we recognize today. One of the most transformative tools they developed was the use of multi-tiered credit chains. Rather than lending directly to rulers or merchants, they created chains of borrowers and guarantors that allowed them to influence decisions several layers away from their own identity. Through this mechanism, they controlled risk distribution, dictated repayment terms, and ensured that any financial collapse would fall on others while they remained protected. This structure became the precursor to modern credit markets, where responsibility is dispersed but influence is concentrated. Their understanding of how debt could shape political outcomes became one of their greatest assets. They also became masters of institutional infiltration. By placing trusted allies in key administrative roles, they influenced tax collection, trade regulation, and early monetary reforms. But these allies were not overt representatives, but individuals who appeared loyal to local rulers while quietly advancing the family's interests. Through them, the family helped shape policies that favored long-distance trade, standardized credit instruments, and reduced restrictions on certain forms of wealth transfer. These reforms, praised at the time as advancements in commerce, conveniently aligned with the family's expanding reach. Another dimension of their strategy involved shaping the infrastructure of commerce itself. They financed roads, ports, and marketplaces, not for public benefit, but to control the flow of goods and information. By privately sponsoring construction projects, they ensured influence over major trade corridors. Merchants who used these routes unintentionally fed into the family system, allowing them to monitor flows of wealth with precision. This strategic positioning resembled what later empires would formalize through central banks and regulatory bodies, but in this earlier era, it was executed through subtle ownership and quiet investment. Their power also grew through the early manipulation of institutional trust. They learned that people naturally placed faith in symbols, seals, and official-looking documents. By controlling the production of financial instruments that appeared authoritative, they created a perception of legitimacy that no local leader dared to question. These instruments allowed them to influence currency circulation, set exchange rates, and regulate cross-border transactions long before the public understood the concept of standardized monetary systems. In many ways, they were designing the psychological foundation of finance, teaching societies to accept value as something dictated rather than discovered. Over generations, the family mastered the art of blending into the economic landscape so seamlessly that their influence appeared structural rather than personal. Their reach extended through institutions that seemed autonomous but operated under the quiet weight of their decisions. They transitioned from manipulating markets to shaping the very frameworks in which markets existed, embedding their logic into systems that would survive long after their names faded from historical memory. As their strategies solidified into a legacy of global influence, the stage was set for the next transformation, where their shadowy methods would become the hidden blueprint behind the powerful corporate systems that would eventually dominate the modern world. As the family's power expanded across generations, their silent methods took on a new and far more enduring form. What had begun as discreet financial manipulation gradually evolved into something resembling the DNA of today's corporate empires. Their influence no longer depended solely on controlling goods, credit, or information. Instead, they began crafting hereditary structures of power, frameworks designed to outlast political regimes, wars, and economic collapses. These structures became early prototypes of corporate governance, built not with public charters or legal documents, but through secret agreements, coded inheritance rules, and deeply embedded networks that functioned like invisible institutions. One of their most groundbreaking innovations was the concept of distributed ownership. Instead of concentrating wealth in a single heir or title, they divided influence among several branches of the lineage, each responsible for a segment of the economic system. One branch specialized in trade, another in credit, another in political alliances, another in information gathering. This division created a resilient ecosystem. If one branch was targeted by rivals or weakened by regional turmoil, the others could sustain the family's overall power. Modern corporations would later adopt similar frameworks with departments, subsidiaries, and diversified holdings, but the family had already mastered this logic centuries earlier. They also formalized internal systems for transferring knowledge. Instructions for manipulation, negotiation, and market anticipation were hidden in coded letters, oral teachings, and symbolic rituals that ensured only selected members understood the full scope of their operations. These practices mirrored early forms of corporate training, offering continuity even as political landscapes changed. While kingdoms rose and fell, their internal structure remained stable, allowing each generation to build upon the strategies of the last rather than starting from scratch. This accumulation of expertise created an accelerating cycle of influence, enabling them to predict and shape market behavior with astonishing accuracy. Another defining moment came when they realized that influencing institutions was more efficient than influencing individuals. By shaping the policies and financial habits of merchant guilds, early banks, and governing councils, they embedded their preferences into the system itself. At that point, even leaders who had no direct connection to the family unknowingly operated within frameworks that the family had designed. This invisible shaping of institutional norms resembled the way modern corporations exert influence today through lobbying, financial pressure, and strategic partnerships. Yet in their time, this kind of systemic influence was unprecedented. Their strategic marriages and alliances also played a crucial role, connecting them to powerful merchant dynasties, ruling families, and emerging financial centers. These relationships created a web of shared interests that protected them from scrutiny. No one wanted to dismantle a system that benefited so many influential figures. This network functioned like a primitive version of corporate conglomerates, where multiple entities appear independent but ultimately operate under a single overarching strategy. Through these developments, their influence became less about reacting to opportunities and more about engineering the economic environment itself. They set patterns that others unknowingly followed, shaped standards that became common practice, and designed mechanisms that would one day reappear in the form of multinational corporations, global markets, and powerful financial institutions. Before we continue unfolding how these hidden structures evolved into modern systems that still echo their logic, leave a comment sharing which part of this ancestral corporate architecture you found most revealing or familiar. As the family entered a new era of influence, their silent blueprint began evolving into patterns that would later define the structure of global finance. What started as isolated manipulations had now grown into a recognizable cycle, repeating itself across different empires, trade networks, and political regimes. These patterns did not emerge by accident. They were intentionally designed to remain effective regardless of who held power publicly. By embedding their methods into the economic fabric of multiple societies, the family ensured that their strategies survived for centuries, adapting to new technologies, currencies, and political systems without ever losing relevance. One of the most important developments during this stage was their mastery of economic predictability. They learned to anticipate not just short-term fluctuations, but long-term transformations driven by human behavior. They understood that markets repeatedly followed similar emotional rhythms, optimism leading to expansion, uncertainty triggering contraction, and fear accelerating collapse. By watching these cycles unfold across generations, they constructed a mental map of economic behavior that later economists would attempt to formalize. Yet while others studied theory, the family acted, positioning themselves in the right place before each shift materialized. Their influence also evolved through more sophisticated methods of obscuring wealth. Instead of relying solely on intermediaries, they created chains of ownership that crossed regions and jurisdictions, taking advantage of political fragmentation to hide the true extent of their holdings. These chains allowed them to remain untouched even when kingdoms imposed taxes or seized assets from rival groups. Their wealth flowed across borders in forms that local authorities did not understand, using instruments that predated what we now call offshore finance. The complexity of their networks made them effectively untouchable, protected not by armies, but by opacity. During this period, they also perfected the use of controlled scarcity as a strategic weapon. Rather than simply withholding resources, they engineered conditions where scarcity appeared natural, caused by climate, conflict, or mismanagement. They manipulated transportation routes, storage facilities, and access to raw materials, ensuring that prices rose exactly when it benefited them. Every apparent crisis concealed an opportunity they had prepared for, reinforcing the idea that scarcity could be manufactured with subtle, deliberate precision. This principle later became a core feature of global commodity markets. Yet in their era, it was an innovation known only to a select few. Their long-term strategy also involved influencing the very systems that recorded value. By participating in the creation of new forms of currency, lending standards, and merchant codes, they shaped not just the flow of wealth, but the meaning of wealth itself. They helped establish practices that determined how debts were measured, how creditworthiness was evaluated, and how trade disputes were resolved. Through these contributions, they embedded their values into the architecture of financial life. Even leaders who had never met them enforced rules built upon the family's original concepts, unaware of how those ideas had originated. Over time, these evolving patterns became so deeply rooted that they appeared to be natural components of economic life. People believed that markets behaved in certain ways because of universal laws, not realizing that many of these behaviors had been shaped deliberately. What made the family's influence so powerful was not just the scale of their operations, but the subtlety with which they blurred the lines between manipulation and inevitability. As their strategies continued to mature, the patterns they designed prepared the foundation for the next transformation, where their silent influence would merge seamlessly into the complex financial systems that still govern modern economies. As their web of influence stretched across continents and centuries, the family's methods became harder to detect, blending seamlessly into the background of emerging financial systems. What once appeared as isolated irregularities now formed a consistent pattern embedded in the very mechanisms that regulated trade, credit, and currency. By this stage, their influence no longer needed to operate through individual decisions. It had become structural, woven into systems so complex that even experts struggled to identify the true origins of certain market movements. This invisibility was not accidental. It was the ultimate refinement of their strategy, power exercised without recognition. One of the clearest expressions of this evolution was their ability to shape the flow of global credit without appearing responsible for it. They understood that entire nations depended on access to capital, and by positioning themselves at key points in these networks, they could indirectly dictate which regions prospered and which fell into decline. Their methods no longer required direct lending. Instead, they influenced institutions that managed credit distribution, enabling them to guide economic development from a distance. This indirect control meant that when crises emerged, the blame rarely fell on the true architects. Their manipulation also extended into the emerging world of financial instruments. As societies experimented with early versions of bonds, promissory notes, and transferable debt, the family adapted quickly. They realized that controlling the interpretation of value was more powerful than controlling the asset itself. By influencing how these instruments were rated, exchanged, and enforced, they effectively shaped entire markets. Their insights into risk, liquidity, and leverage foreshadowed the sophisticated financial engineering that would define modern finance. In every new system, they identified its weaknesses and gently steered outcomes in their favor. A powerful element of their strategy came from their ability to exploit complexity. As financial systems grew more intricate, fewer people understood how the underlying structures worked. The family intentionally encouraged this confusion. By supporting new layers of regulation, intermediaries, and accounting methods, they helped create an environment where transparency was nearly impossible. In this fog, they thrived. Ambiguity became a resource, enabling them to move capital, influence markets, and accumulate wealth without raising suspicion. Observers saw only the surface: officials, merchants, and institutions. They never saw the quiet hands directing the deeper currents. The family also maintained their advantage by mastering the political dimension of finance. They supported leaders who adopted monetary policies, aligned with their interests, and quietly undermined those who resisted. Their influence stretched into advisory councils, commercial courts, and emerging financial hubs. They did not need to control governments directly. They only needed to ensure that those in power accepted economic assumptions shaped by their worldview. Once embedded, these assumptions steered policy decisions for decades, sometimes centuries. Over time, the traces of their activity became so faint that they resembled natural patterns. Market fluctuations, debt cycles, and monetary crises appeared to be the inevitable consequences of commerce rather than the result of deliberate calibration. Yet anyone who looked closely would notice the recurring signals: sudden shifts in liquidity, unexplained price surges, and synchronized collapses across distant regions. These signals formed the trail they left behind, not by accident, but because influence on such a scale could never be entirely invisible. As their story approaches its final layer, these hidden patterns reveal how deeply their logic penetrated the system, setting the stage for the financial world we know today, built upon foundations they quietly engineered across generations. By the time their influence seeped fully into the foundations of modern finance, the family had already achieved something far greater than wealth. They had created a system that operated with their logic, even when their names disappeared from historical memory. What made their legacy so powerful was not just the accumulation of assets, but the architecture of control they left behind. Their silent frauds became the unwritten rules that shaped monetary policy, corporate behavior, and the rise and fall of entire markets. The same patterns that once guided ancient trade routes now echo in global exchanges, central banking decisions, and the movements of capital across continents. It is almost impossible to separate their methods from the mechanisms that keep the world economy running. Their legacy persisted because they understood something fundamental about human behavior. People trust systems more than individuals, symbols more than intentions, and structure more than transparency. By embedding their strategies within systems, they ensured that the world would adopt their methods without questioning the origin. Institutions that claim to preserve stability often rely on principles the family pioneered: controlling liquidity, shaping narratives during crises, concealing risk, and guiding markets through subtle incentives rather than open force. These ideas became so normalized that generations grew up believing they represented natural economic laws. As corporations emerged and expanded, they unknowingly inherited the family's blueprint. Corporate hierarchies resembled the distributed branches of the lineage. Complex ownership structures echoed the family's layers of concealment. Internal decision-making mirrored the private counsels the family once used to direct trade, credit, and political influence. Even the concept of shareholder value resembled the family's early insistence on loyalty and return across generations. The modern economy did not replace their influence. It amplified it, scaling their techniques to a level they could have only imagined. But their most enduring impact lies in the cycles that still define global finance. Inflationary surges manufactured through policy decisions, asset bubbles inflated by coordinated enthusiasm, sudden contractions triggered by strategic withdrawals of liquidity, and recoveries fueled by carefully timed injections of confidence. These cycles resemble the original pattern the family perfected centuries ago, repeating with such regularity that they form the rhythm of economic life. The world interprets them as fluctuations of complex systems, but beneath the surface, they carry the unmistakable signature of the family's early experiments in control. Understanding this legacy does not require believing in a conspiracy or imagining a single hidden force still pulling strings. It requires recognizing that systems built on certain principles continue to operate according to those principles, long after their creators fade. The family shaped the economy by embedding methods, incentives, and patterns that outlasted nations, ideologies, and eras. And today, the structures of global finance still follow the contours they quietly designed, operating with the same discrete efficiency and the same capacity to shift wealth without being seen. If you reach this point, leave a comment saying, "This message was for me, so I know you followed the trail to the end." If this content helped you understand the hidden logic behind modern financial systems, consider subscribing so you do not miss the next chapters of this investigation. A simple like also helps this story reach more people who are trying to understand the world behind what they see. And if you want to keep following this thread, there's a video here that continues this line of thought, so click and stay with me on the next part of this journey.